I think probably first and foremost, like my mom died when I was 19 days old. I don't have any memory of that, obviously, but I have no doubt that it had a huge impact.
I mean, even in the lessons that we teach, it's about transforming your waste into wealth, right? It's about recognizing that in the same moments your trash and your traumas are created, so are your deepest treasures and some of your greatest gifts. But the choice also comes down to choosing the light more often than not, as well as choosing who am I going to be and how am I going to live and communicate that to the world through my actions.
And the turning point for me was that burnout. And I had this moment, Brian, when I woke up. How have I gotten to this point where I'm so far from who I am? That was a question I asked myself. And then the penny dropped and I was like, holy crap, I don't even know who I am. The journey is the destination, right? We all know what happens to us. Everybody knows how it ends. We all fucking die. That's it, right? So if we all know that that's the fact that we die, then the only thing we have to do is focus on what is happening right now and the path that we're making as we walk it.
Welcome back, everybody, to Flipping the Lid. You know what we do here by now, and I just continue to be amazed by the depth and quality of the guests that we get and the ability for them to have real, raw, authentic conversations that can translate to change and growth for you. Today, it's no different. I've had the pleasure of getting to know this individual through a couple of interactions, and he was on my live show. We were just joking pre-show here because I believe that pronouncing names is such a sign of respect, and I wanted to ensure that I said it correctly. So I'm going to bring it full circle in a second, but I want to tell you a little bit about this man first. He's somebody that has been able to recognize that the path that he was on in life was not serving him to his best interest. He readjusted his life and put himself into a position to really learn how to grow and expand, and also wants to be able to help over 1 billion people have accessible and affordable ways to get the coaching that they need to be able to live into the lives that they want, and so many other things. This individual speaks with eloquence and with depth, and it's his own stories that shape his teachings today. And so, Jean-François, I'm happy to have you here today. And I think I got that right. But from now on, I may refer to you as JF like you gave me permission to do, just so that I don't get the tongue twister. However, bro, it's so good to have you here.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for this really beautiful introduction. And you absolutely nailed the name. So that's fantastic. And henceforth, JF is absolutely fine. Thanks for having me, Brian.
Beautiful, my friend. Well, the only question I ask every single guest on this show is the one almost immediately following my introduction. And it's, who are you in your words, my friend?
Who am I? God, that's a big question, big opening question. I'm me. That's all I have for anyone, really. And I'm the me that just tries to be more me every single day. And actually, that's been a big realization, I suppose, in the last few years, since my burnout, really getting to the bottom of who I am, but also being okay with the notion that that's never really going to be static and that's always going to evolve. So the short answer is, I'm just me. I'm Jean-François, and this is what you're going to get today.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that. I also appreciate the succinctness and the directness of it. So now I'm going to take you a little bit deeper into you, right? So if you are just you, what are the things that define you from your perspective, the values, the ways that you operate through the world? And if you were to give us clarity to describe who me is, how do you communicate that?
Yeah, I think, again, incredible question. I was following some of the stuff about your prompts on ChatGPT, and I know you're really good at prompting and asking questions. I'm a coach, and I appreciate a good question. You probably captured the notion that actually for most of my life, I identified myself with what I did, and then I stopped doing that. So to answer your question succinctly, Brian, my values are openness, curiosity, courage, integrity, and unity. In that order as well. And if you're interested, we can go into this. And so that's the first slice of the sandwich that I am. And the top slice would be my purpose. And my purpose is to help others realize their purpose. And I suppose as part of this conversation, we can explore the middle bit and everything like that. But do you need any more color commentary on who I am?
No, I mean, I appreciate you playing with me there for a second and understanding the reason to take it a little bit deeper on that. I do believe that, clarity is one of the things that creates the most amount of freedom for us in our lives, right? Whether it's clarity in an individual conversation, clarity into something we're listening to, clarity in something we're trying to learn, but also clarity in ourselves, our purpose, our vision, our values, and how we align these things. And so, so much of the work that I do often is just to try to be the most crystal clear mirror reflection back to people and use the questions and the way that I see them to be able to help bring those things out. And I know that you understand that and appreciate that just based on the way that you operate and how you yourself communicate. Right now, I appreciate the ability to communicate your values with such clarity and even in hierarchy and order, right? There's like clear conviction in those words and the depth of what they mean for you. If I use myself as an example or a model, though I can articulate to you the ways and the values and the beliefs and the convictions that I have today, I know that what they are today is not what they always were. And what they are today is often a byproduct of what they evolved into or what I was able to shed or get clarity on as a result. And so maybe bring us back into that prior period of your life a little bit and talk to us a little bit about who JF was, right? And how you were living based on what you did and what was the turning point for you?
JF was at a time probably defined by the fact that I worked at various level and doing various things for a large tobacco manufacturer for 14 years of my life. Started in Canada, moved to the UK in London. And I would have said, I'm an internal or communications manager, or I'm a trade marketing manager, or all of the things that probably I was as part of my corporate career. And I think that was a big part of my identity for a number of reasons. I think there was definitely an element of nurture. That's what my parents were and did for a long time. And that's kind of what was transmitted to me and what was encouraged that I did to a certain extent going through university, study business. Now you need to get a job, start on the ladder and keep building your career like that. So a lot of nurture, but obviously this isn't my parents' fault or anything like that, because I think nature comes in and at some point there needs to be that line that you cross into making that decision for yourself. And I think I don't want to say the 14 years of my corporate career, but for a large period of time, I just started to define myself by the fact that I was going to be making more money and the next level I was going to go at. And because I spent not 40 hours, like 50, 60, 70 hours sometimes just doing that. And the doing became the being. And the turning point for me was that burnout. And I had this moment, Brian, when I woke up, the lockdown restrictions had just been eased in the UK. So my wife, Tash, had just booked this like cute little cottage in this very sanitized room, of course. And I kept waking up at 5:30 or 6 o'clock in a panic because I knew no one was going to be checking my emails. I was the only one doing this job. No one could support me. I felt completely alone. And then I was like, how have I gotten to this point where I'm so far from who I am? That was a question I asked myself. And then the penny dropped and I was like, holy crap, I don't even know who I am. Right? Going back to your original question, who are you? I had none of these building blocks, the pieces of the sandwich that I talked about. And I'm thinking about it, I'm getting goosebumps because I'm like, that's crazy. I'm like 30, I'm in my mid 30s. And then I thought about, oh my God, what about like the people in previous generations? Have they ever asked themselves these questions? If they have they followed up on it? And anyway, big realization. And that's kind of the turning point for me to kind of like pivot away from, I suppose, who I did. You see what I'm trying to do here.
Yeah.
And then turn really towards myself and uncovering all of that. That's how I am here today in front of you.
That's beautiful. I appreciate the nature and nurture elements that you integrated into that. And I think that oftentimes their nature is what brings in the most authentic self. Nurture, in some cases, either reinforces it or takes it away from us. Right. And, I often talk about, us being born as our brightest, most authentic burning light. And then all of a sudden our parents, teachers, coaches, employers start saying, you should do this, you shouldn't do that. You should want this, you shouldn't want that. And it starts shaping us right into this box and this funnel based on who the world has told us who to be instead of who we really are. But a lot of the work that I do with people in a more intensive way, at least as it relates to unpacking the patterns of their past, the trash from their past, has to do with the cellular memory and resonance that still activates in our bodies and our emotions and our minds and in our spirits, sometimes decades after it's taken place, or even in some cases, multi-generational. If we look at our trash and our triggers in our own household, my wife and I have traced it back 3 generations, right? We can look very specifically at not only into the nurture elements in our own lives that conditioned us there, but also to be able to see the cellular elements of trauma that pass through the DNA and the patterns that can become multi-generational. So you becoming the prior version of JF, this person that identified with what you did, was also shaped based on those conditions. And so if you were to give us a little bit of a narrative around, your early childhood, your upbringing and your experiences that you believed caused you to wear that external armor to be who the world wanted you to be instead of who you really were, what were the primary factors that shaped those?
I think probably first and foremost, like my mom died when I was 19 days old.
That's big. Yeah. That's big.
Yeah. I don't have any memory of that, obviously. but I have no doubt that it had a huge impact. And in fact, part of my recovery from burnout involved, first of all, emergency therapy to deal with burnout. But then I went back to therapy afterwards to kind of unpack the traumatic building blocks that kept me stuck where I was and where I didn't want to be anymore. So I think, my birth mother passing away, and then my stepmom, who I call mom, coming into the picture like 3 months later at 22 years old, and then, falling in love with my dad, and then deciding to actually essentially adopt a 3-month-old without really having lived her own life, lived her 20s.
Or context of even 41. What that means. Yeah.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Yes. I'm 41, don't have kids yet. And I'm thinking at myself, like deciding to adopt like a 3-month-old child, the impact that must have had. And so I think that was really fundamental to my upbringing, the relationship that developed between my paternal grandparents, who had a view and an idea of how they wanted to raise me, and then Pauline, who wanted to raise me kind of in a new age way, right? She was like, well, I never had a kid. I'm 22 years old. I'm just going to go and read all the latest, right? But like my grandmother was like, well, I raised a kid, so I can do it myself. So I think there was a lot of friction at that level. And this all came out through years and years of discussions, bits and bobs, right? As it does. I think about Pauline as kind of my model of femininity and how I relate to women. And Pauline has always been a very strong, powerful, self-sufficient person. We butted heads constantly. And, it's only recently that we've, I suppose, like metaphorically buried the hatchet. But one of the things that I got from Pauline is an immense respect for women. And I've never had, as a result, any issues with women in power or being managed by a woman, my work or anything like that. So I suppose what I'm getting at is these are just a few of the building blocks I'm just throwing out at you, Brian. But like, I see like the shadow and the light, the yin and the yang of all those building blocks a lot more clearly now that I have obviously hindsight, but that I've been able to verbalize all these things. And I think really importantly, there are elements of shadow and light to all those building blocks. I wouldn't be the person I am today without the trauma that I've gone through. That also shaped me into who I am. But critically, and I think you kind of alluded to it, I believe, there's a decision that needs to be made, right? Mm-hmm. Am I the person that I want to be? And if I'm not, then I need to change. You alluded to kind of like, well, it's an evolution of my values or whatever it is. Maybe they will change. I will tell you in the last 4 years, my core values have not changed and they feel so good, but I'm not disillusioned enough to believe that, I don't know, in a few years, maybe when I have a child, maybe that'll evolve, maybe that'll change. And I'm okay with that, right? There's a piece because I've gone through it.
Yeah. I think it's really important, and I'm happy that you brought both the light and the dark into it, because I often talk about how life is really about contrast, right? In so many ways. Even in the lessons that we teach, it's about transforming your waste into wealth, right? It's about recognizing that in the same moments your trash and your traumas are created, so are your deepest treasures and some of your greatest gifts, right? The question is, are you able to see them through all the trash? Are you able to articulate them through all the trash? Are you able to, be able to demonstrate them as your power and your potential to the world, hidden and buried behind all that muck and yuck, right? And so what I love is that you're so clearly able to articulate the building blocks, as you call it, right? That shaped and molded you, but also to recognize that, like, again, without light, there is no dark and vice versa. But the choice also comes down to choosing the light more often than not, as well as choosing who am I going to be and how am I going to live and communicate that to the world through my actions, right? It is a very complex, nuanced dynamic, but, one particle of light can overtake over 1 million particles of darkness, right? And so if we want to live with more joy, freedom, and fulfillment, what are we choosing to focus on? And what are we choosing to live into, right? In all those moments. And clearly that's a byproduct of choice that you have put yourself in a position on. Now, what I will say, and I want to be clear when I say this, I have an intuition here, and it's not to challenge where you're at or the clarity of your values, but rather to just suggest that where you're at in the trajectory of your progression is, I wouldn't be surprised if your values didn't change for another 5 or 10 years. But I have a sense that this understanding of depth and self that you have today is still a very, in comparison, surface level to the depth that's within you. And my sense is that at some point, those values and that purpose will shift to even a deeper level of clarity and an even deeper level of resonance. Again, I could be off on that.
No,
I'm
man,
using
look,
some of my own trajectory to map that. So I recognize my bias, but I'm speaking about it for you, JF, not for me.
no, and Brian, look, man, like I feel that. I know that. Like your intuition is correct. I suppose here's my question back to you. What is the depth of our humanity?
I think it's far more infinite than we see in day-to-day life.
Bottomless?
I don't know that there is a bottom. Yeah, I don't know.
That's
I think
nuts, isn't it?
and again, that's where I sit with, is that like anything that lacks depth doesn't really interest me, to be perfectly honest. Right? Like that's how I live my life. If it doesn't have depth, I'm out. And it's not by like choice or judgment. It's just, it cannot capture me. Right? It doesn't operate at a frequency and a vibration that I can receive that puts me into a place where I feel deeply connected to it, unless there's some element of depth, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Let me ask you this. This is going to maybe sound like from the left, but like, how do you feel about reality TV?
Oh, I hate reality TV.
Is it because of that perceived lack of depth?
Well, and I know how scripted it is, because I know a lot of people who've participated in reality television
So
who
fake
years later have also
lack of
talked
depth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are two things that I just don't, again, authenticity and depth are two things that I deeply value.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's how I live my life. Right. And so, yeah, my wife loves reality television because it's a form of satire and entertainment. It's not right. Like, but that's not my type of satire and entertainment, because it's real enough that it feels toxic to me. Right. Because of the lack of depth and the fakeness that's in it. So versus like a sitcom that's written for the purposes of comedy, that's intended to be a satirical approach towards humanity. Like those I can connect deeply with, especially if they're intelligent writers, because they embed so many layers. And if you really understand that, you can connect. But yeah, reality television, I struggle big time. Now, I say that with a couple of exceptions. Reality television, as it relates to highlighting the social dynamics of our world, I am not a fan of. Reality television that take people on an adventure, that teach them something, that demonstrate a unique skill set. Like I love cars. I love building cars. I love working on cars. And therefore there are so many reality TV style car shows that walk through and demonstrate a custom car build that I could zone out on for hours, because I'm paying attention to someone in their area of brilliance. And I'm also watching a very tangible application of brilliance in a way that I may not have the ability, but I can learn from and admire. Right. And so I realized that was an interesting evolution of my thought, but that's my answer.
Yeah. So what's come up for you then as this evolution of your thought? What have you realized then?
Oh, I don't know that I realized anything new. I think it's just the way I articulated it to you.
Okay.
I mean, these are things that I've talked about with my wife many times, but I was just more meaning I could have said, no, I hate reality television, but instead I gave you a dialogue. That was, I think, what I was suggesting. I mean, here's the thing, Jean, Jean-François, since I said Jean, I have to finish it, right? JF, this is something that I actually appreciate, though. Like, I appreciate when people actually ask me questions on my own show.
Yes.
And so I'm going to slow down and just honor that, because that's also not a very frequent thing. And though I can completely drive an interview wherever and however deep we need to go, I just appreciate the back and forth. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that, because your own answer and your own curiosity is demonstrated by your ability to ask your question. And so for those things, I'm happy to play. But I mean, what's your take on reality television now that we're talking about it?
Well, I don't really have much love for it. I remember being there when like Survivor came out, and it was like, oh my God, what is this? This is like the cool Richard winning Survivor for the first time in like 1999 or something like that. And then I remember there were like new ones coming out, like Fear Factor with Joe Rogan was one of those, right? But then I was like, okay, I've seen like 5 or 6. I feel like I've seen them all. So I don't really spend time watching reality TV, and probably to a certain extent for the same reasons as you do. I just don't feel that we need the dramatized version of like the emotions that we live in real life, because I don't know, there's enough drama in my own emotions, man. Like I live through like fear and anger and anxiety on a daily basis. I live through love, excitement, playfulness, and creativity on a daily basis. I have enough of that in my life. But that's not to say, again, I love the fact that you brought up that your wife actually loves it, because I understand why people love it and sometimes like want to binge it. It's just not something I've subscribed to. However, I do love horror films, and I have asked myself why, and I'm not like 100% clear why. Not a lot of people in my life love horror films. I can't talk about it very often. Actually, I'm going to be on another podcast with Emily Paulson, and she loves horror films. So I told her, like, can we just have like 5 or 10 minutes to talk about horror films and what they're about? I suppose there's like a vicarious thrill that's involved in that. So yeah, it's something I don't necessarily comprehend. I know a ton of people don't like, but it's something that I really, really enjoy watching. So there you go. No reality, but horror, absolutely.
Yeah, again, on this string of thought, because I think it's interesting. I agree with you. I'm not a big fan of the competition shows, right? I like those. Anytime that they're gamified and things like that, just doesn't. I don't connect with it. Except for like American Ninja Warrior, which is just fun to watch, right? Like, because they're doing cool stuff. But like for me, that's less about the competition and more about like seeing again somebody's ability,
the ability of these people, right?
Totally, right. And again, so like I all these nuances of totally. I will tell you that a reality show that I did watch that I did enjoy, and it was more of a documentary style, but it was done in a reality TV style, was Love on the Spectrum. That started in the UK. They did a really, really beautiful job with that show. And, there's lots of reasons why I appreciated how that one was, curated. And then, like I said, probably these more educational style, but I think it's fascinating. I would love for a second to just explore this concept of horror films with you. And there's a resonance in you bringing that up because my son loves scary horror films and he's 10 and I don't enjoy them. And it's not that I don't enjoy them because of how they make me feel. Like I, for often reasons, don't connect to the storyline because it's so far out of like reality that that there's times when I imagine, like I love Marvel, right? All the Marvel movies, like none of that shit's real, but I like it, right? But on the horror side, for whatever reason, it's just like, I'm like, okay, like I'm not a big zombie guy. I'm not a big like, right? And I say all this because it's interesting because I was exploring with him, excitement, anticipation, and anxiety all show up in the body the same way.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
Right?
That's good.
And so if you think about like often in moments, one of the ways I was able to break this down for myself was people ask me still, they're like, do you get nervous when you go speak on stage? Right. And it's like, well, I feel things in my body and I used to believe that I was nervous. I used to believe it was anxiety and there were elements of it that were in prior periods.
Yeah.
However, what I've realized is that it's not anxiety, it's anticipation and it's a build of energy waiting to be deployed into an environment, right? But the same concept with choice comes down to this as well. If excitement, anxiety, and anticipation all show up in the body the same way for most people, then what's the label we've decided to place on that energy and emotion? And what is the meaning behind it? Right. And using this as a example in horror films, right? This can apply to so many other things in terms of, again, the choices of the patterns that exist within us and the ways that we choose to rewrite them. But if you were to sit and further evaluate what it is about horror films that keeps you connected, keeps you interested, keeps you going back, like describe that feeling and experience for yourself.
There's a sense of safe jeopardy.
Huh.
I honestly, I've never been asked this. It's the first thing that came up.
Yeah. That's an interesting word choice. I like it. Describe that a little further.
I can like feel stuff and feel unsafe, but I know I'm safe. And there's obviously a very intellectualized version of like, I watched Terrifier the other day. And I don't know if you've heard about that, but like,
I haven't.
It pushes your 10-year-old son should definitely not watch that. Actually, should totally not watch that.
We're being very cautious with what we expose them to right now.
Yes, please. Yes, please. So I was like, oh, I've heard about it. Made a big the second one and the third one made a big splash. So I went back to the first and like it was the first time in a film, a horror film, what actually I had the physical urge to vomit in a specific scene. Never happened to me because I'm usually able to kind of detach myself, intellectualize what I'm seeing. And, and when I think about horror films, I really do like the Paranormal Activity, The Conjuring, where like you have a slow like creep into the corner of a dark bedroom and you're like, oh my, and I feel this coming up on me and I'm like, oh my God, what's going to appear? And actually I'm feeling it now and I love it. It's really good. But also because it's a film, I know it's like, I'm not in any kind of jeopardy. And it's interesting because my wife doesn't like it, especially anything that's too like graphic, because she really viscerally feels it. Whereas as soon as it gets graphic for me, and I remember I was like a teenager when like the Hostels and the Saws came out, right? Like
Yeah, me too.
body horror.
Yeah, me too.
Right?
You and I are about the same age, I think. Yeah.
And I was able to kind of like go like, okay, well, it's kind of gross because there's like a chainsaw or whatever going into an eye. But like as it happens, I'm like, I can kind of like remove myself from that and go like, okay, not shut down, but like switch. Okay, now I'm watching like really good special effect. That did not happen with Terrifier. Don't watch it. Don't get Danielle to watch. So yeah, Save Jeopardy is and how I've just explained it, I think is where I'm major. Thank you very much for creating a space where I can talk about this.
Yeah, no. I find the analysis of ourselves to be fascinating, and not everybody is able to on the fly reflect in the way that you are as well, in questions that they've not been asked. And I do appreciate your ability to explore just real time. It's interesting because I often talk about how I needed to push the limits of death just to feel alive so often in my life. And it wasn't replicated or experienced in the same way unless it was being physically experienced by me. Right. And so I am someone, I have a very, very, very high risk threshold when it comes to my own physical safety.
As in like you've been like skydiving and like all those things, or
I have not done everything that you would imagine, but the way I lived my life always would push it to the edge. And that was how I was born, but it was only further reinforced when my arm was detached from my body in the injury, and just like my pain threshold and rush threshold, it like went through the roof. Right. And so where I'm going with this is I think it's interesting because even as you describe it, it's like Safe Jeopardy. Right. Which is not much different than what I'm describing, because you're trying to activate your nervous system and safety centers in a way that make you feel something more deeply and more profoundly than maybe without that stimulus, which allows you to connect to either parts of yourself or however you've associated safety around that feeling in the past to be connected. Right.
I'm alive.
Right. And so that's what's interesting about this is that based on how you describe it and the way that you talk about it, it's almost like you're seeking a sense of life and connection through what it ignites within you. And in a way that, to your point, feels safe to explore, but not unsafe to your real physical self. Whereas I was the opposite. I needed to put myself in physical jeopardy and feel it to like experience it to that level. Right. Like,
have you, sorry, Brian, I hate to interrupt, but like, I need to like, is there anything that you can actually reveal on this show that you've talked about before? Like, what do you mean actually by like pushing your own sense of safety, physical safety?
I mean, I can give a number of examples, but one of them was, well, I could give you a couple, but I'll give you one that I've talked about probably the most.
Yeah.
My left arm was severed from my body, reattached, 24 surgeries.
Completely severed.
Oh, completely off. Yeah. Completely off.
Oh my God.
Bro. It was gone. Yeah. And I could give you tons and tons and tons of anecdotes, but one of the ones that I've talked about a lot, because it came through to this really breakthrough moment, was when I was 20, I was snowboarding and I went down in basically a very basic mode and rebroke my left arm, compound fracture to my upper arm, and ultimately 10 months with it hanging by my side because 7 surgeons were afraid to touch me because of medical malpractice. So when I say like my pain threshold was up here and my rush threshold was up here, like understanding that wrists and humerus are typically the top 2 breaks for snowboarders.
Yeah.
Probably not the best decision for someone with my background, but I never allowed my arm to stop me from doing things. And I was a very good snowboarder. I did trick parks. I would jump off boxes. Right. And what's funny is I just caught a bad edge the time that it broke.
Right.
But through that whole experience, I was the only one in the state that knew my whole understanding. So I didn't allow them to give me pain meds because I didn't want to be incoherent with understanding what I knew was a very complex medical situation. And so like the whole story just continues to progress. They had to do basically like 2 field settings in the ER where they tried to reset the bone because even though it would normally be surgery immediately for a compound fracture, they were afraid to touch me. And they didn't set it correctly the first time. So they had to do it another time. And it was literally like I was in a battlefield, like just gritting my jaw to get through the pain and maintain consciousness. Right. But when I talk about like the level at which I have and consistently would push myself like that to the limits of what my physical body could handle, that was how I experienced feeling alive.
Hmm. And how does that evolve? Like, do you still seek risk and thrill in that way, or is it like moderated
Not in the
itself?
same ways, because I'm in the season of dad, and a lot of that shifted when I became a father. Not from I don't live anymore, but I'm just more intentional. I haven't snowboarded since then, because the likelihood of me having another break that could be derailing at that level is high. Right. Because it just happens. And if you're pushing the limits and you're not just playing it safe, like, you're going to go there. And so, yes, there's things that I have removed and revised in my life for that purpose. I don't have the emptiness that I had at that point in my life that was what I was seeking to fill. Right. And so it's also a very different place that I'm at, because I feel alive every day. I don't need to push the limits to feel that. I now have the ability to be present in whichever moments I choose to be able to experience the life that's happening right in front of me. And it's so I would just say it's evolved, right? Like, do I still do things that push myself to the levels that many are like, what the fuck are you doing? Yeah, I do.
Like spicy food? Like spice level?
Like just everything. Because that's kind of how I live. Like, and I know that, but I'm more calculated in my risk taking today than I used to be.
Well, there's jeopardy now. There's greater jeopardy now with your
and I don't live from a scarcity mindset or a zero sum game on what I'm going to lose either. Right. So that's the other side of it, is I have to constantly just caution and pay attention to that, because if I live in that state, the frequency also isn't producing or developing and bringing towards me the things that I want. It pushes it away. And so it's like a very interesting dance that I've learned to ultimately live in, is how to allow myself to take the calculated risks while not having to stack or potentially lose everything, as well as the fact that, like, I'm also not afraid to lose everything. Because I've already been through the potential of losing the three things that matter most to me, which are my wife and my kids. And I repaired that. And we're on the other side of that. And I'm like, outside of that, like, come at me. There's nothing else you can take from me that I would be affected by in the same way. So
would it make sense? First of all, thank you so much for sharing all of this, Brian. That's like really cool for opening up to me like that, to us, I suppose. But like, the impression I got as you were talking, I sense like almost like there's an addiction pattern. There was an addiction pattern, and now you're.
Oh yeah. Yeah. 100%.
Right.
I have a highly addictive personality. There's no doubt. I mean, my personality and my identity was attached to pain. And it also was very much around the intellectual armor that I carried for years that conditioned a lot of this, which was that Brian's good, Brian's strong, Brian's capable, Brian can do anything himself. And I fucking did. Right. I know exactly. I mean, dude, I've dissected this shit inside and out, because it's the work I do as well. But yes, there absolutely was an addiction pattern to it. And that's one of those things it's no different than any addiction pattern. It's a matter of understanding, like, is it taking you closer to or further away from who you are and who you want to be? Right? Is it being more additive in your life, or is it being more destructive and damaging in your life? And if you can be honest in those questions, I don't view addictive personalities or addictive patterns that keep us connected to things as bad. It's, again, are you able to answer those questions? Right. And so I've been very intentional my whole life to channel what I knew was my addictive pattern into even places that I knew were not, like, I never did cocaine. It's one of the few drugs I didn't do because I figured I would like it too much. And everything I'd heard about it and everything I understand now about stimulants towards an ADHD brain and how it actually brings us clarity and calmness, I would have been a fucking cokehead if I did it. Right. And I know this, and I knew that then. So, like, there were things that I was very intentional with because of what I learned and understood about these models and the way they showed up in my life and that I was living into. So, but I want to bring this back now to you, to the question that I asked you.
You have.
Okay, go ahead.
I just want to say thank you for bringing this up, because actually one of the big questions I've had for myself this year has been around my own addictive patterns that I've noticed in myself that I've had for years. You know, I smoked from 14 to 28. I use nicotine from I still kind of use it occasionally from 28 to like now. Cannabis has been a part of my life, you know, since I was, again, 14 years old. You say
I'm by definition a pothead. So just to be clear, like,
so like for me, I deeply resonate with what you just said. And I would just want to, with unbeknownst to you, what you've actually given me now is actually a really good question. Like, is this bringing me further or closer to who I want to be and who I am. And because I have been banging my head against the wall, like, oh my God, am I like, is this good? Is this not good? Like, is this detrimental to me? So I just want to say thank you before you could actually ask the question that you wanted to ask.
No, I mean, I thank you for reflecting that back. I think that's something that we all need to pay attention to. But I think there's a lot of shame around this concept of addiction because of what it typically correlates into, which is damage, right? Because we think of addiction as drugs. We think of addiction as sex. We think of addiction as alcohol, right? And a lot of these end up being more toxic and damaging. I'm not trying to label that as definitive because people may have their own perspective, but in general, these patterns can create more damage in people's lives, right? And so, but if you look at some of the most highly successful people in any venue, there is a level of obsession and addiction to what they're doing that has driven them to that level.
Yes.
And there is a persistence, a consistency, a connection, just drive to reach mastery or to live and exist in that state as much as possible. And when that's used and channeled for good, right, for yourself, for those that you care about, or for the broader sense of humanity, why is there any level of shame for the fact that I have an addictive personality and I recognize that I don't dabble in anything? I am the person that like goes insane in anything that actually creates my interest, whether or not it's an interest for the rest of my life. Like I'm the guy that'll get interested in a sport and go buy all the equipment, reach mastery in as little time as possible, and then decide, does this fit into my life?
Yeah.
Right. And because it's exploration as well.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
And so as long as, again, we can constantly answer those questions for ourselves, why does something need to be defined as good or bad? And whose standard is defining that to begin with?
Yeah.
Right.
Preach.
Is it taking you closer to or further away from who you are and what you want?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's kind of that simple.
Yeah.
So if you can still pick back up on that string of thought, I don't even remember the question I asked you anymore. It was around this whole concept though.
No, this is great. I love how this has evolved into an actual conversation. I think honestly, how do I even say this? I didn't know what I was going to get out of this, but I'm glad I listened to my instinct and got curious about you because what you've just said about addiction is exactly what I needed to hear right now at this point in my life. We have come exactly where we were meant to be. Like it feels profoundly right. So that's why I just shut up because there was nothing else I could say. You just mic drop without dropping the mic.
Since we're on that topic, why don't we explore that just a little bit? Because I think it's relevant. Like where does addiction in your belief show up in your life? And what are the narratives that you've tied to it?
That it's bad, right? You were just like in a word, really, that's what it is, right? And I suppose when I say this, I've probably got Pauline's voice in my head, right?
Okay.
Yeah. And I think that's really significant as
Again,
well.
whose standard is it?
Yeah, exactly. 100%. I actually, on December 26th, 2020, I woke up. I did not remember Christmas dinner. I barely remember having an argument with Tash. And I was like, I'm going to stop drinking for a year in my head. I told my wife I wasn't drinking. I told no one how long I was going to stop drinking for. No one. People were just like, well, is this temporary? And you have to understand, Brian, I live in the United Kingdom.
Oh, yeah. There's a whole cultural component to that. It's huge. Yeah, totally.
Pub life, especially for men. To actually be able to bond, alcohol typically almost needs to be involved. It's not necessarily healthy. I love a lot of things.
I would say that's not uncommon in the United States either, my friend. You're right, though,
Yeah,
from
well,
the UK being a
Absolutely.
different, there's elements of Europe and the UK that have a deeper ingrained piece to it, but that's how it's often used in cultures, particularly with patriarchal or man type structures.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. One thing I do love about the UK, and this is this kind of like, you can buy alcohol whenever you want, kind of wherever you want. You can drink in the street. There's no infantilization as I experienced it in Canada when I lived in Canada. But the flip side of that is there's a binge drinking culture that's almost like baked into the culture anyway. So I woke up on that December morning and I made that decision. And I actually ended up not drinking for 2.5 years. And the first 6 months were really difficult because of the habit that I had of like 5 p.m. I need to crack the beer because now it's after 5. I'm not working, obviously. Functioning something. I don't know if I was an alcoholic, but I wasn't liking who I was without putting a label on it. And so that was the first 6 months. The back end, of the second 6 months was really about kind of like the social construct and the social context around it. And once I'd done it for a year, I was like, I'm not drinking. And then slowly it came back into my life, but like out of a desire or want to do it, as in like, oh, this is actually going to enhance my experience right now. And it was really interesting because now I drink socially and I'll have like 3 pints, which is like probably way more units. It's probably considered binge, actually. 3 pints is a binge in the UK, probably elsewhere as well. But like, I'm like loosey-goosey, having a good time with my mate, come back home, and I'm like, oh yeah, I had a great time. And one thing that came up when I started drinking again, actually, my good friend Dan was like, I didn't want to say this while you were not drinking, but it's good to have you, a little bit on the booze again, because then I feel like I can open up to you in a safer kind of environment. And I was like, that's crazy for so many reasons. But anyway, that's kind of my relationship with addiction. And I know now that I've done this with alcohol and I've started moderating cannabis consumption, right? Like pot, trying to like examine how I feel without it. My sleeping patterns are vastly improved when I'm not smoking, right? Relatively anywhere before bed. So I'm dreaming more. My dreams are more significant. I derive more from them as well. So I suppose in some way, what am I saying here? Sorry, it's a bit of a monologue, but what I'm getting at, which I hadn't gotten at before, is really like, I think I'm like quite able to be self-aware about what's going on. And actually, now that I've done all of this and you've given me a space to talk about this, I know I have an addictive personality, but I don't think there's anything I'm doing right now that's actually detrimental to my life, to who I want to be. What really resonated with me, a few minutes ago, you were talking about like, I'm paraphrasing, but right, focusing on something and being obsessed with something, quote unquote. And like, this is how I feel about Wabya, right? Like the business that Craig and I are building it's not even a do, it's a be, it's who I am. So I could, if Tash didn't tap me on the shoulder at like 6:30, she was like, hey, you've been in front of your laptop for like hours now, and you probably should go outside, take a break. I would probably keep going. And Craig's the same way. So I know it's so meaningful. So am I addicted to who I am and how I want to create myself? Yeah, probably. That's probably the only addiction, but I have no worry around it.
Yeah. Do I have permission to reflect a couple things back to you from what
Absolutely,
you just
please.
shared?
I have no idea what just came out.
It's interesting because I also do believe that you, like me and others who have operated in elements of shame in the past, learn to receive love, validation, and connection through performance. And so as much as I sense while you're talking about this addictive personality, what I also know is that you have defined 1 billion people impacted by 2033. And if you remember from our live call, one of the things I challenged you on was the limiting nature of what those words are, both as it relates to it could happen way faster, but also in terms of the limitations and the pressure that it puts on yourself from an expectation standpoint that drives in towards performance. And so, by the way, though I feel and experience the same way, I can lose myself in my work very, very often. I think that there is a very clear and distinguished difference between understanding being connected with my work because of the goal or the external impact that I want to make versus living and enjoying in my work throughout each moment. And they're very different. And so I just challenge you to explore that a little bit because I sense as you're talking that it's probably both. And so on the other side of it, if it's any element of performance, pay attention to that. And then the last thing that I would say is that if your buddy feels that he can be more safe with you, it's easy for us to sit here and put that into a bucket of like, oh, that's how socially conditioned it is that I need a drink in my hand for this to take place. On the contrary, though, I would challenge you and say, what is it about you when you're drinking that changes or shifts that makes him feel a different energy? Because that doesn't require an outside influence if you can understand what it is. What I find is that the liquid courage that we consume often lowers that external energetic perception of armor in whatever we're protecting within ourselves. And for someone who's so intellectualized and deep and self-progressive, I'm sure that some of your friends feel a level of threat around not being able to connect with you because of the way that you operate and the level at which you do. And so I suggest this to you because as you go to 3 pints, there's also been science to prove what alcohol does at a cellular level in changing our frequency. And it's attached directly to the shame cycle, which is the lowest level of frequency. So even though you may be unencumbered and unarmored, it also changes your whole state. And so it lowers your actual ability. And I sit here to say, not that the drinking itself is bad. I myself have a very similar story. It was about 6 years ago I stopped drinking. I now am at a place where even if I have one drink, I can feel it in my body for as much as a week, even if I never got drunk or felt a buzz from it. And so therefore alcohol doesn't have a role in my life. But I also only in the last 18 months got to a place where I didn't feel I needed to have a glass in my hand to feel like I was getting in the social appropriation, or to a point where I would happily order a water while standing at a bar with multiple people holding drinks and not even hesitate, because it doesn't change who I am or how I show up. And so that's what I would just reflect back is I think in both those dynamics, there's opportunity for you to go deeper, right?
Yeah.
And again, make yourself more powerful.
Yeah. The one thing, okay, so the first thing that really resonated with me, so thank you for playing that back. And actually, that's a great perspective shift in terms of like, oh, what is it with me when I was drinking that got Dan to feel safer around me? That's definitely something I'm 100% walking out of this conversation with. The second thing, I think part of the reflection that you gave me, Brian, was I really pondered after you said the 1 billion by 2033. And actually, there's an immense amount of peace that I feel, because one of my big journeys this year has been like finding, labeling, identifying emotions, making sure that I'm clear on what they are, where they come from. And there's a huge amount of peace because I don't feel any pressure at all about like, oh my God, it's got to be 1 billion. It's got to be 2033. I just feel it's a good signpost to have. And one of the things I've learned quite a while ago was that the journey is the destination, right? We all know what happens to us. Everybody knows how it ends. We all fucking die. That's it, right? So if we all know that that's the fact that we die, then the only thing we have to do is focus on what is happening right now and the path that we're making as we walk it. And so for me, any idea of a signpost, even if it's 1 billion by 2033, or I'm not going to drink for X amount of time, is more indicative than it is like an actual driver or push. And I do find myself intrinsically motivated on a daily basis by what I do. And it's so great because I sit and I work on Wabya. And then if I don't feel like doing something, I'm like, well, what am I moved to do? It's like, okay, cool. I want to go on Canva and be creative right now. I'll use AI to make some music or do images. And like, oh, now I feel like responding to this email. Now's the right time to do it. Man, it is a game changer. And I see you nodding, like it feels that really resonates with you because you look and feel like a guy that's doing that.
I understand it, and I fully accept and receive what you say about the energy and the resonance towards those two numbers. What I was suggesting in there is, regardless of if that's the signpost that's creating some of the performance piece, all I was suggesting is to evaluate that. And I sit here and receive everything you say through acceptance and belief, because I'm not ever going to be the one that's going to argue or suggest or try to tell somebody how they feel or should feel. I don't give two fucks about being right. I care about getting it right for whoever I'm talking to. So it's not, there's no ego or agenda for me to push this further. What I would suggest, though, through a lens of just challenge of perspective, is that, again, our intake forms are very, very basic. Okay. And so I accept and believe that everything you just said is true to you. Yeah. You also articulated that your biggest problem in life or business right now is that you're facing professionally is patience and trust. Yeah. And so if it's patience and trust, then again, what is the standard or what is the performance metric that is being focused on that you are not believing that you are where you should be in whatever time frame it is that you believe you should be there. Yeah. And so maybe talk about the contrast of this truth that you just spoke for yourself and this reality that patience and trust are still your biggest identifiable problem in your professional life.
Yeah. Yeah, you're absolutely right, Brian. And I completely had forgotten that that's what I had written. And to be completely honest, the only metric I have right now in kind of like receiving and responding to what you've given me is like the deep knowledge that this isn't a situation at all. In fact, the best part of what you reflected back to me had probably to do with my perception of Dan and my relationship. And then thirdly, I suppose, so thank you for trying to reinforce. It probably might sit and I might percolate on it. And
it's okay. Again, I have nothing to prove. And if I'm off base, by all means, like tell me. Well,
I don't. And the only reason I'm reinforcing this is because I've told you already that this is something I'm at peace with, and you've reinforced it a second time. So maybe I'm feeling unheard, and that's why I'm pushing back slightly on it.
No, and that, by the way, that's okay. I want you to if it doesn't land. That's how I operate with everybody in my world. Again, what I was trying to do is just understand from a position of clarity. Because when I see a combination of words or situations that suggests maybe something's not 100% aligned or congruent, I'm not going to be the one to sit here and tell you that it is or isn't, or what it is or isn't.
No, you're going
to suggest that you evaluate it, and you may come through further iteration to a place. Your lights just went off. That was really funny timing. You're like, I'm out. I don't want to talk to you anymore, Bogert.
Fuck off. I'm out of here.
Fuck off, dude. I've already told you twice. No, but that's all I'm suggesting is I ask that you just give yourself the space to evaluate that a little further, right? Because I'm not going to sit here and tell you what's true or not for you.
I do have a question. I know we're coming up soon on time, but like
we're coming up.
I'm really curious about, because the third thing that you brought up in the reflection was, right, you talked about alcohol, and it's not been a part of your life for like 6 years or something. Did you say 6 years? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, 5 or 6. Somewhere
you
in there.
qualified yourself as a pothead earlier, so I'm assuming you still smoke. Smoking is part of your life.
Oh yeah, daily.
Talk to me about like that difference. Like, what is it about?
So weed came into my life as a healing modality, like completely. I mean, I had smoked some in college and smoked a little bit throughout the years as it became legal in Denver and other places. But when I say a pothead, like consuming it regularly, consistently, and with purpose. When I say pothead, to be perfectly honest, the definition of a pothead doesn't really fit me, because I'm not somebody that uses it to numb, and I'm not somebody that's high all day long, right? But I use it every day. And it came about as a result of pain. And where I was at in my trajectory of pain, it was that or narcotics. Yeah. Well, it was whole body pain, but it was caused by the injury and other things. And it was either going down a path of narcotics, which I knew the impact of that, or exploring with using this as medicine. And so I used it primarily for pain and sleep. But then I also started to recognize that with intention, it really is a healing modality, right? Like paranoia is directly tied to insecurities. So if you know this, and in fact, the first time I ever was able to identify that I had social anxiety and could like understand how bad it was how paranoid I was the first time I was high in public, because I felt like everybody was looking at me. And I was like, oh, I need to work on that. Right. So instead of retreating into like, I'm terrified and paranoid and I start shaking, I could pay attention to what the cells were reacting to without the inhibitions to block and protect it intellectually, and allow myself to understand and explore. And I've done that in many, 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 many facets of healing and creativity in myself. And so it truly is used as a medicine. If I look at how it affects my body, we know that alcohol has toxic properties to it. It's not good for us. It is a poison.
That's why you get
for all intents and measures. It is. We don't have any natural elements of alcohol in our body, right? Whereas we have natural cannabinoids in our body that get activated, right? It's a big reason I'm a fan of plant-based medicine in general. I have microdose psilocybin for the same reasons, because nervous system impact is massive if you understand how to use it with purpose for healing and replicating what we have. But it was only within maybe 6 months of when I was starting to smoke more that I think I had stopped drinking a period before that. I don't remember the exact timeline, because alcohol also correlated to inflammation and pain in my body. And it brought out all the worst parts of me. So my wife very quickly was able to identify alcohol brings out all the worst parts of you and the parts I hate and don't like. And weed brings out all the best parts of you and all the parts of you that I love and endear and like are the most authentic you. And it's like, okay. And so pain has been there, but emotional exploration, better understanding of self, creative ability, it has become a medicine and a tool for me in my life. And it's always used with purpose. I say always. There are sometimes I just get high to fucking get high. But at some point, when you smoke as consistently as you do, or as I do, right? Like I don't get high most times I'm consuming. It's about how it activates or shifts things in my body energetically, or opens things to allow me to explore. And those things are so that's the contrast for me.
Okay. So, just clarifying two things. First of all, one thing that really came up for me is something I've been thinking about cannabis and how I react to it. I always have this image of like my antenna being super open when I'm high. Like it's just this absorption. But the one thing that you said that really kind of nudged something was like, I think it goes back to what you were saying about like it lowers your cell's defenses, and you realize how anxious you were in social situations. You're like, fuck, I need to do something about that. I haven't gotten to that point yet, but I think this
most
is a
people
realization. No, but this is a new realization for me, Brian, because I think either sometimes I'll smoke up and I'll be like, oh my God, like these are all the best ideas. And I'm like, I need to write this down. And like some of them have like evolved into actual marketing campaigns and everything like that. But then sometimes it's like there's a lot of anxiety, right? Probably maybe going back to the trust maybe thing that we were talking about.
I'm just yeah. Maybe.
My question has to do with how do you, like, what's the process, very simply, as simple as you can put it, with regards to going like, oh, I'm anxious about this, I need to address this. Do you do it when you're high or do you do it afterwards? Like, what's the process for you?
Both. And it depends on the situation and how deep I need to go and how much work needs to be put into it. But it's no different than resetting our patterns in moments of trigger when we're not under the influence. Right? Like it's no different than me realizing that I have an internal reaction or defense mechanism in something that my wife said, and me being able to separate in that moment based on what I really believe is true. Right. And so for me, it's no different. It's about getting ourselves in our body. And again, not looking at it through a lens of shame or blame, but rather through observation and understanding and with clear intent. And so again, that's where I think I just know I don't dabble in anything. So this is no different, right? Like I focus on patterns. I pay attention to like what changes, and when it would activate into a place of paranoia, what it also confirmed for me is I don't have a lot of insecurities anymore. I used to, but I don't anymore. And here's the thing, the really only big one that it really ever exposed for me was social anxiety. And it was bad and it was deep. And that was something that I had to like really put intention in working on. But outside of that, there's not a lot that ignites that feeling for me. And so that it became very intentional and explorative. But there are things, little elements that have not been as deep that have bubbled up that I've been able to just like, again, acknowledge and be like, oh, wow, that's weird. I didn't realize that this was something that I had insecurity or even thoughts or feelings about, right? Because it just allows, right? No different than our ability to get downloads and to have access in a more sensory perspective to, as you call it, like that extension or however you described it, the antennas, right? It gives us an external and an internal antenna if we learn to listen to it and tune into it.
Yeah. Yeah. I suppose there's comfort with like, I'm feeling creative and motivated, and discomfort with kind of like, oh my God, like this is not a positive.
How's that any different than when you're not under the influence though?
Well, no, you're absolutely right. It just seems magnified when I'm under the influence.
Right.
And I think
so that gives you opportunity to focus on it, right? Yeah. Instead of panic and react to it.
Yes.
Right. It's a matter of like, oh, I can intellectually separate in the moment and realize that I'm under the influence, which means I'm probably going to be deeper in my feels, which means that it's probably going to be more extreme. Yeah. And so if I can recognize that my whole world isn't closing in on me right now, and that I am actually safe in this moment, and I can use my intellect to reason and recognize that I put myself into this state. And once I'm not high, I won't feel this way in the same way as I am right now. Then it's a rationalization that then allows you to start to deconstruct it. Right. But again, it requires that level of like observation and intention in how you navigate it. Which is what a lot of this stuff comes down to. That's the only way we break these patterns and develop new ones in our day-to-day life. But again, with this underlying lack of trust, right? No fucking question or doubt. There is a deep, granular, embedded element that's rooted around abandonment in the fact that your mom was gone 19 days into your life. Yeah. Yeah. Like, that's not the only reason. I'm not going to sit here and say that that's it, but is that absolutely connected to an underlying level of lack of trust? Of course it is. Because at a granular fucking cellular level, when we're brought into this world by our genetic parents, there is a DNA genetic hardwired desire to be cared for and loved by the people that brought you here. Right. It's what we all seek and desire most in terms of that nurturing element. And despite you having people there, the mother often plays the most important role in that transition into this life. And so, again, I don't mean to go there to say that, but I think that that's what I would challenge you to do is, again, explore, not with judgment, but with observation and keep on the path that you've already been doing.
Yeah, I wish I could.
I know you are.
Absolutely. It's literally, I had this conversation with my coach like 3 days ago, and this came up again, and we had a wonderful kind of discussion and discovery around that. But I think the point is I am on the path, and actually
I know you
really enjoyed this conversation, and you have signposted other elements that I can kind of like keep walking towards, I suppose.
And here's the reality. You got to live in your values today. You got to live in your purpose today, because your purpose of this exploration, helping others find theirs, was fulfilled by you being a model and example for the fact that the journey never ends. For you, for me, for any of us, we're all on it, and there is no final destination. And so for that, I want to say thank you. I know you're doing this work not only for yourself, but helping so many others. And so I do want to give you a chance before we wrap today to just give a short little narrative around Wabya and the best places that people can find and follow you. We'll put it all in the show notes. And then I'll probably ask you one more question and bring this thing to a close.
Yeah. So Wabya is an acronym for We Are Because You Are. And what we are doing is making self-realization accessible and affordable to everyone through coaching specifically, because coaching puts you in the driver's seat of your own life. It's a very powerful method. We only work with certified coaches, and what we do is we match you virtually with these certified coaches, and that gets you on your journey to resolving whatever it is that you feel needs resolving in your life. You can find us at wabya.com. So www.wabya.com, at We Are Because You Are on Instagram, and at We Are Because You Are on YouTube. I think those are the highlights, really.
All right, my friend, I'm going to let you just channel for 1 second. What's a closing thought you want to leave the audience with today?
Just be you. That's literally your only job, is to be who you are. Uncover and create that. And you can't fuck it up, because there has never been, there isn't, and there never will be anyone else like you.
That's a mic drop moment. Jean-François, thank you so much for being with us today. I appreciate the depth at which we went and what we were able to explore. And I look forward to future conversations with you, my friend.
Lots of love. Thank you so much, Brian.
Yeah. And as we all just saw JF jump in, he was real, he was raw, he was honest. He talked about the things that shaped his life from a foundational perspective, the dynamics of nature versus nurture, and how those byproducts can show up in our lives years later that we've been unconscious to for years. But it ultimately comes down to a choice. You have that choice in any given moment to decide, are you going to live based on who you are and who you want to continue becoming, or are you going to live based on who the world told you who to be? It comes down to decisions and dissecting and understanding yourself in a place of grace that allows you to grow. But it does require two things from you. You're going to need to flip open your lid and scan your can. See you next time. What you can probably tell by now is that I love telling these stories, but what I love even more is the impact that's coming from them. You see, we're on a mission to impact over 1 billion lives as quickly as possible, but to do that, we need you. See, we believe that moved people move people. And so all I'm asking is, if you've resonated, connected with any of the messaging, please consider commenting, sharing, leave a rating and review. Thank you so much for tuning into Flipping the Lid. And if you want more information on the show, how to become a guest, how to recommend a guest, or any of the other details, head over to flippingthelid.com. We'll see you there.